Sin?
Hey everyone, my name's Sin. I like they them pronouns. I'm on YDC's National Coordinating Committee, and I'm a head steward in UAW Local 2865. I'm a student at UC Berkeley.
Kyle?
Hey y'all, Kyle, he, him. I'm a PhD candidate in the music department at Columbia, sixth year. Yeah, it's just really looking forward to the talk today. Yeah.
Great. Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD student in biology at Columbia, and yeah, happy to be here.
Basia?
Hi, I am the member of GSA, and I was the participant in New York Taxi Workers Alliance strike. I was one of the hunger strikers, which I last for 15 days, and I really believe in the youth programs. You guys are really doing amazing job. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I know, speaking for me and at least several others on here, I'm sure everyone, we've been incredibly inspired and moved by your hunger strike. That was incredible. So yeah, wow, we're definitely honored to have you here.
Thank you for your support.
And finally, Kevin.
Hi, I am Kevin, he, him pronouns. I am a teacher and Master of Fine Arts in writing at Columbia, and currently striking with them.
So yeah, so we're gonna talk about some as I mentioned earlier, just how to sort of like keep doing what you're. How do we replicate what you're doing? What does that mean that you're all on strike right now? But kind of first of all, before we get into that, I did want to know, at the excuse me, at the risk of sounding like kind of basic or something, like why we're all interested, like why are you on strike? I know like Sophia, Becca, Kyle, Catherine, Kevin, I know y'all are all like striking right now, right? Like, can you tell us a little bit about why you're doing that? Hello?
Yeah, I can go for it. For me, our goals are pretty straightforward, but I personally also believe in the movement as something that's part of a greater push toward equity for workers in the country and around the world. And I think being able to join that, even as just a graduate student, is that I'm part of this as much as someone at Amazon or John Deere is very important to me.
Yeah, I reject the sort of girl bossism and instead submit that we subordinate our egos to this larger tradition and movement as a way to feel truly liberated. Anyone else here from Columbia? Can y'all like, because again, like I know Willem was a former student, but like Matt and I have just been kind of following from the sidelines some, so. Like, I guess we're kind of curious about like what got y'all to the point of going on strike. Yeah, totally. Catherine said, my field is notorious for abuse. We need recourse. I don't know what your field is. I was in the English department for about 6 years. But I remember a lot of my my STEM co-workers just had really bad times as grad students and student researchers.
One thing we can think about if we're like thinking of answers for this question too is like why are you on strike as opposed to other means of recourse, such as, petitioning, other like forms of action? Like, what was it about the strike that seems like an effective way of getting leverage as students and workers? So if anyone just has any thoughts on that, it'd be really interesting to hear.
I mean, I think a lot of times people talk about strikes, right, as this sort of like, we did everything we could do and none of that worked. So now we're going on strike. It's like the sort of like most powerful tool you have. And when all other methods of recourse have been, have tried and failed, right? You withhold your labor. You stop doing the thing that the thing that it is that you're supposed to do, right? And you create these sort of like political or social or economic crises for your employer. In this case, it's Columbia University. I hope that they're feeling really embarrassed and ashamed right now, and that you're all massive thorns in the side of the administration. I think the idea, like as I'm sure everyone here knows, like going on strike it's scary, but it's also great. This is the power that you have, is no one has anything individually. Like when I was a grad student, I'm not going to go up to the dean and be like, please pay me more. It doesn't work. No one cares. What they respond to is like collective and mass action that you all exercise in your capacity as workers together, making this university run. But I guess, and Willem's going to talk some about this, like it feels, for me anyway, like it feels good feeling powerful and sort of exercising that power that you have, that you always have, that's like this sort of potential, but that you don't really get to realize too often in your everyday life. But if that's the case, like why aren't people on strike all the time, right? Like I think that if we would just say like, oh, well, if collective action gets the goods, why aren't we getting the goods constantly? Why aren't we engaging in this sort of like collective action all the time? And Willem's going to talk a little bit about like some of the kind of historical trends of why everyone isn't just striking left and right in this country all the time.
Definitely. I think like that's what we'll go into in this next section, this discussion. And it's okay if it's a little bit less interactive, but like, why are we on strike is a first question, and something that I think you all have asked yourselves and decided that striking is the most powerful way to exert collective action. And in a lot of cases for workers, it's the only option to increase their working conditions and their pay. But once we reach that answer, I think the question becomes, why aren't more workers on strike? In the last month, labor journalists have deemed the uptick in labor action as Striketober. There are 10,000 workers on strike at John Deere. Columbia workers are the second largest strike in the country. And there's a lot more labor action now than in the previous months. But this leaves tens of millions of workers who aren't on strike. And in fact, in the last month, there were 5 million workers who quit their job, but there are only tens of thousands of workers on strike. And so what we're going to talk about right now is why aren't more workers on strike? And so for me, in order to answer this question, you have to look at two options. And one of the reasons is the decline of union membership. And the second reason is the conservatism of unions themselves. And so what we're going to talk about right now is how both of these reasons are interlinked. And so first, in order to understand this problem, you have to understand the decline in union membership. And so obviously, when you see the workers going on strike right now, the thing that almost all of them have in common is that they are members of a union. Like obviously, this isn't a panel about unions are somehow bad or something like that. Unions are absolutely necessary to have the organizational capacity to give workers the leverage in order to exert the power over an employer. And so you see workers across the country who have no other option to express their dissatisfaction with their work than to leave. So you have millions of people quitting their jobs who maybe if they're members of a union might be able to band together to ask for better conditions. And so there's a small minority of the workers in the country, about 10%, who are union members who have this option to do collective action. And 90% of workers in the country don't have this option. And so right now, what we want to talk about a little bit is historically why this might be. And so if you're familiar with labor history at all, we can look back to the 1930s and 40s as kind of the peak of organized labor in the United States. And so in 1940s, union membership neared toward 40%. And so in the last 70 years, it's declined all the way down to 10%. So we want to talk a little bit right now about why that was and the option and the reasons for this decline. So in order to understand the decline, we want to understand some of the reasons for its uptick in the first place. The 1930s have some similar historical circumstances to now, in that you had this terrible recession and terrible working conditions that kind of came to a head and resulted in increased worker militancy in the 1930s. In 1934, it was a dramatic year for worker self-organization. There were strikes across the country, including general strikes in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. And there was, I think, something like, there were millions of workers on strike every year during these decades, compared to just the tens of thousands of workers on strike now. And so this militancy led to a response from the American government. So in 1935, you had the Wagner Act passed, which for the first time legalized collective bargaining, legalized the right to unions. And this combination of the militancy, which led to the legal protections, led to this uptick in worker action and also worker organization. So you have this period of worker strikes and worker unionization, which leads to some of like the highest wages and benefits that workers have ever experienced up to the 1950s and 60s. But ever since this time, the union membership in the United States has been on decline. And there are three reasons for this decline. And in order to understand these, where we are today, we want to look at each of these reasons and try to look at these reasons as ways for us to fix this decline. And so the emphasis that we place on each reason is going to, in turn, lead to the solution that we want to focus on to combat each reason. So for example, if we only look at economic reasons for union membership decline, this might lead us to thinking that this is nothing that we can do about it. Like if the only reasons unions have declined in the United States is because all of the jobs have been gone overseas, then that's something that's kind of out of our control. And if the only reason for unions decline is that worker protections have disappeared because of legal changes, this is also something that maybe we could just go to politics. But we're going to look at these just very quickly to discuss the role that workers have played and unions have played in their own decline. And so the first reason, like I said, is the economic reason, which is just the fact that we have lost a lot of industrial jobs in the past 70 years. These industrial jobs are usually the most unionized, the most organized, and the most militant. And so obviously with some of this decline, you're going to get some decline in union militancy. But this doesn't nowhere near enough to explain the decline in overall union membership. And in addition to this decline, we can look at the legal changes. In 1947, there was a law passed called Taft-Hartley, which led to a decline in union membership because of the fact that they outlawed secondary strikes, they made it harder for workers to organize, and they also expelled communists from existing labor unions. And so obviously these legal changes have had an effect as well. And this is why we're organizing for legal changes to protect workers as well. But if you only focus on these two options, we're missing a huge element. And I think it's something that workers at UAW at Columbia might be familiar with, which is the natural conservatism of unions in the past 50 years. And so when we think about this natural conservatism in the 60s and 70s, instead of resorting to strikes, authors like Jane McAlevey and Kim Moody have looked at the fact that unions have got away from strikes as their first response to workers not having enough power, and have resorted to other methods such as campaigning, lobbying, doing rallies, and doing under the table negotiations with employers rather than having workers be the ones fighting for their own benefits. And so the reasons for this are somewhat disputed, but as Kim Moody points out, unions are in a difficult position between the employer and the workers, where they're trying to negotiate a contract that keeps both of them happy, because if the businesses don't exist, you can't have workers. And if the workers aren't fought for, then unions aren't doing their job. So unions are in this like very difficult position where they're over time going to try to box themselves in from the pressure on both sides, from the worker and the business. And so because of this, you're going to get to this natural state of stagnation for unions. And you see this in the UAW especially, where you have these like contracts negotiated that don't really involve the workers. And so instead of having the workers being the first ones to voice their frustrations, a lot of times they can be kind of left out of these conversations. So in order for workers to be involved in worker actions, a lot of times they're fighting not only against their employer, but against their union as well to try to go on strike, which you're all doing right now. And so if you look at the past 50 years in the conservatism of unions, this is one of the reasons that's contributed to this decline of union membership and just contributed to the amount of strikes today. And so now that we've taken this slightly lengthy detour, I apologize, to explain the decline in union membership and why there are less strikes today, we're going to go to Matt to talk a little bit more about what this means for us today and the efforts that are being taken to combat the conservatism of unions more recently, especially Matt's union, the Teamsters, but also just the actions today by workers that are going against this natural conservatism of unions.
That was really awesome. So yeah, in the Teamsters, you know, I think we present like a pretty interesting example of stronger reform tendencies that unions can have, but it's also kind of like because of the history of corruption in the Teamsters that's kind of like brought this about. The Teamsters are kind of like famous for their corruption, you know, with like Jimmy Hoffa basically building Las Vegas like out of the pension funds type corruption and getting involved with the mafia. But we're also known, you know, especially among like left circles, for an organization called Teamsters for a Democratic Union, or TDU for short. And TDU has essentially grown. They started in like the 70s, and they've grown from a position of, you know, one word I almost like think about when I think of TDU in the way that like sort of Hoffa old guard Teamsters would view it. It's almost like they were seen as like terrorists or something when they first emerged, to the point where, you know, they had their lives threatened, you know, faced kind of like physical attacks and stuff like that. But over time, it's actually gotten to a point today where we're actually looking at a strong possibility that TDU is going to have some serious influence on the next basically executive board in the international as a whole. And so like, how does a reform movement go from a place of like such a small, you know, minority that basically puts themselves in danger every day to a position of real kind of like structural power? And I think that's an exciting story like within the Teamsters, but it's also, you can see a similar kind of movement that's happening in UAW as well with UAWD. And so, for example, like there were some UAWD people at the TDU convention that was held in this last October. And one of the things that obviously UAWD is fighting for is the one member, one vote, you know, situation, which will bring to the leadership of that union, which will obviously influence the way that union exercises its social and economic power. And the way that the Teamsters actually got one member, one vote was as a kind of like reaction to the extreme corruption back in, I think it was like the late 80s or early 90s. The federal government almost trusteed the Teamsters and basically like put the entire union under federal trusteeship, but instead what we got was one member, one vote. And as a result of that, we elected kind of like one of the Ron Carey. He's actually out of Teamsters Local 804 in New York, and he led the union on like a successful strike in 1997. And so to show is that when you finally like have the ability to elect leadership democratically, obviously, you know, if there's high member involvement, you're going to elect someone who's going to fight for the membership, and as a result, they're going to support when it's like, you know, a good idea to do so, leveraging your power as workers and fighting against, you know, whether like the company that you work for or the school that you work for or something like that, so that you can you know, gain power. And I think that goes to show that the institution, like the union as an institution, while it has, you know, this conservative tendency, which is obviously to kind of like maintain business, you know, like if UPS just like stopped functioning, then I would be out of a job. So obviously on one hand, you need to be working with the company to make sure that your workers are going to have wages at the end of the day. But on the other hand, you have to make sure that you're, you know, fighting for your workers' best interests as well. And the only way that you can really do that is by keeping the leadership accountable to the membership. It's like obviously a good way to do that. Are the other things that you said I was supposed to touch on?
If we could just talk a little bit more about the strikes going on today and how those relate to the reform efforts, especially at UAW.
So, I mean, obviously, like we know, like is on strike. United Metro workers who are actually Teamsters, United Metro oil workers in New York are on strike for a first contract. And I mean, I think that, I mean, that's kind of a broad question. Hold on. What are my thoughts, Willem?
Oh, definitely. I think one thing we can do just before we move into the last section is just like kind of like hammer home and to kind of like summarize this huge amount of information that we've thrown at you. And the point that I want everyone to take away from all of this, whether it be the history, the reform efforts right now at UAWD and TDU, and also the strikes today, is that through history and also today, the actions that are being taken at labor are almost always being driven by the workers and not by the unions themselves. And so what's remarkable when I look at the labor actions happening today, especially the two biggest strikes that are happening at the same time that you have the two hugest elections in labor happening in the past several years at UAW and TDU, is that the workers are not just striking against John Deere, against Columbia, but they're also having to work somewhat against their own union. And so at John Deere, at the 10,000 worker strike going on in the Midwest, they've had to reject several contracts that have been negotiated by their own union, which is kind of a surprise to the union because usually this doesn't happen, this kind of worker militancy. And the same thing at Columbia. Obviously, I'm sure that people that are here today are familiar with the fact that last spring, the contract negotiated was voted down by membership in a move that very rarely happens. And then in the summer, the 10-person reform slate that is now on the bargaining committee ran on the idea of reform. And so what's really exciting for me when I look at the labor situation right now is seeing the self-activity of workers and seeing the fact that workers are fighting for themselves, not at the direction of anyone else, but actually at the direction of themselves. And I think that if you look at history, this is the time when workers usually win the biggest victories is the times when they have this kind of like self-motivation and self-drive. And kind of like to wrap up on this point and then to finish with where we're going with the rank and file strategy, I think we need to, like, as socialists, so for me, Hannah and Matt, socialists who really want the labor movement to succeed, this analysis is crucial to the way we look at labor and the fact that workers need to be the one fighting for themselves and winning their own gains and not anyone else. And so we're going to explain the rank and file strategy very quickly, which is the idea that instead of reforming the labor movements by becoming politicians or whatever it might be, the most effective way to build the strength of labor is from below as workers. And so Matt, Hannah, and I are all either union members or future union members as teachers, nurses, and a UPS driver. And so we're going to talk briefly about the decision to go into each of these industries and why we think that it's most effective to go into these industries as workers, and the effect and the history of the reform movements within each of these industries. I guess maybe do we want to pause for any questions before we move on to the last section here? I know we've gone over a lot of information, or just like question or comments from any of the UAW members here, or just anyone else in the audience. You can just type stack in the chat or raise your hand and Hannah will call on you. If not, we can take some questions at the end.
I know Becca too left, but she said she was on the bargaining team, and I was wondering if anyone here, like, what your experience of being on strike with your coworkers and of sort of like, does anyone here have any experiences with UAW, kind of like international, like big UAW that they want to share, like through your experience of going on strike and organizing your coworkers? All right, well, I mean, again, as a former UAW member, it was really interesting. We had some people who were kind of anti-organizing in charge of my old local and what the local SIN is currently in right now for about 7 years. We went from about 65% membership statewide to 35% membership statewide. For all of you who are on strike now, it doesn't feel good going to the bargaining table being like, yeah, give us what we want. Guess what? 3 out of 10 workers here are in the union. They're like, wow, cool. I mean, not that numbers are everything, but like to not even be able to pretend to present a credible strike threat and bargaining from a place of no power, it feels horrible. And it was kind of interesting because when we had a low membership and low engagement, not only did the university not take us seriously, we got a series of really bad contracts, but also sort of UAW International was able more to dictate the things that we did because we didn't have this swell of worker militancy and this swell of rank and file engagement from below, right? UAW at the top could say what we were doing works. We didn't have the numbers to change that. So for instance, UAWD, this reform effort, this kind of reform group within UAW that's fighting for, you think it's crazy to say like, yeah, we're having this huge fight over the fact that we should democratically elect our leaders, but there we are. At 2865, some of us wanted to basically, without getting into too many details, support UAWD and support these one member, one vote efforts. And we were actively stopped from doing that because we just didn't have the engagement of, a ton of rank and file workers at UC. So we were like, hey, let's have a vote to support UAWD so that they can have this conference and do all this stuff. Like if our local would have voted on it, it would have given more power to these movements, whatever. And we were just actively stopped. We just didn't have the power to do that. but for the past few years, there have been these organizing efforts going on within UAW. I don't know if you all have been following the SRU campaign, the Student Researchers campaign, but through engaging our members, now we got enough engagement that there's actually a new NLRB campaign being run for student researchers at UC. That's about 20,000 new people who basically do all the same work we do, but who weren't unionized and who weren't represented by the union. It's going to basically double the amount of student workers at UC who are represented if they win. That wouldn't have happened if we wouldn't have power, but also now through this engagement, 2865 now all of a sudden supports UAWT, right? So it's this thing where like the more engagement you have from below, the more power you can push back on what Willem was talking about, these conservatizing efforts of the union. Unions don't always become these forces of kind of conservatism, right? What happens when they become that is when there isn't rank and file efforts to push back on them. Unions have this amazing potential. I mean, think about it. This is the only organization in all of the United States that you can be in that your boss can't be in, right? You and your boss can both vote for the Democratic Party or whatever. You can both be, quote, members of the Democratic Party. Your boss cannot be a member if you're a union. So these sort of natural sites of class formation and class struggle, and they have this enormous potential. And imagine if people, like everyone on this call, if we were the ones kind of agitating from below and able to direct the movement of the union versus, you know, someone who's been up at the top for 40 years or whatever, and, you know, has no real connection to rank and file organizing. So anyway, through my experience with UAW, I was not loving being a grad student for a while. I felt like my brain was kind of atrophying, and then I got involved in these efforts to bring our union to majority membership and actually present a threat to the university. And that was, I like to call it, like, it was a pill so sweet I couldn't get enough. So I wanted to do this for forever. I want to make organizing and sort of socialist praxis part of my everyday life. So that's why I want to be a nurse. I want to organize, help organize healthcare workers as a fellow healthcare worker. One example of efforts happening in healthcare organizing today is, I don't know if anyone followed the Alameda Health System strike. Alameda County is basically where the county where Oakland and Berkeley are in California. And so people at Columbia, like, do y'all have something like a board of regents? Or something like that? I'm guessing you probably do. Alameda Health System is a public hospital, but the board of supervisors, who are these politicians, appointed a board of trustees for Alameda Health System. And this board of trustees was made up of, like, you know, the CEOs of like pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, ambulance companies, whatever. So although this was a public health system, it was essentially run like a private enterprise by all these people making decisions who are completely unaccountable, completely unseen by the public that the system was supposed to serve. So Alameda Health System workers, all the healthcare workers in this system went on strike last October. And their main demands weren't, I mean, they had your regular kind of bread and butter demands, you know, better wages, better hours, but actually their main demand was, screw this board of trustees who's making all of these decisions and running this public hospital like a for-profit private healthcare system. And because there were people organizing their coworkers there for years, trying to get this massive rank and file engagement, this like bottom up swell of insurgent power. They won, you know, everyone was involved in this strike. It was not one of those things where like, it was kind of like a protest or whatever. I mean, there were about 3,000 people, everyone who worked there, who were said, we're literally not going to go back to work until we get this board of trustees dissolved. And they did. So none of these private people, private corporate people are making decisions for this health system anymore. And I was kind of thinking, like, I'm sure that you all can relate, like at UC, the Board of Regents was the main guy on the Board of Regents at UC is Dianne Feinstein's husband, who's a billionaire real estate developer. I don't think he's making decisions on behalf of students and workers that would be good for students and workers. He's making decisions on behalf of UC to make it more of this like massive force of real estate speculation. And I'm sure that you all know too at Columbia, the Board of Regents who makes all these decisions, do you think that they're making decisions for you or for your students that sound nice? Do you think they even know what you do? Like, do you think that they have any idea what your day is like at all? I could guarantee that they don't. So if you could imagine if you could get rid of them, not only would your sort of like material situation be better, I'm sure you'd have more money, better hours, more support, more protections in the workplace, whatever. But imagine what you could fight for in terms of resources for your students, right? Or even in terms of resources for your community. Right now, Columbia is just buying up all this property everywhere, displacing people who have lived in New York for forever, causing all these like serious problems, not just for students and workers, but for you know the working class of New York generally. If you all had decisions about where those resources went, how would how would you do it? I'm sure it would be completely different. So the point of what I'm saying is that the reason that we want to do this type of organizing, getting everyone involved, getting everyone engaged and fighting against these powers isn't, and why you know a lot of us anyway are interested in doing this as socialists, is that it's not just about like, you know, your specific conditions at your workplace. It's about how we allocate resources more generally, who's in charge of them, who gets them, where they go to. If we have a fighting, organized workforce and labor movement, we can make decisions not just for ourselves, but for, you know, society generally. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going into nursing right now. I want to be part of that. Yeah. So anyway, I'll try and find an article to share here about the AHS strike, but very exciting.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. And if there is anyone else here that's a grad worker that is feeling similarly to Hannah, simultaneously inspired by their actions within the grad union, but also discouraged by academia, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of a similar feeling and why I'm going into teaching and the strategic industry of teaching for worker organizing. In the past, I guess, decade now, almost all of the major actions that have happened within organized labor have been within teachers. So this goes from, I think in 2019 was the Los Angeles and Oakland teacher strikes. The largest strikes of the past decade have been the Red for Ed teacher strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And then in 2011, some of the most important teacher strikes happened in Chicago for the Chicago teacher strikes. And the reason that these teacher strikes are so important, especially for me as a socialist, is that teachers have a special power within their community. And when teachers go on strike, they have the ability to affect every person. And kind of like grad workers do as TAs, teachers aren't just fighting for their own working conditions, they're fighting for the learning conditions of their students. And so when teachers go on strike, they have the ability to fight not just for themselves, but for everyone else in their community. And so briefly, and just to kind of wrap things back up and hammer home this point, one of the interesting things about almost all of these strikes is the role that socialists have had in pushing these strikes forward, and the role of the underclass, the workers and the workers from below, in pushing these strikes forward. I think the best example of this, well, there's probably two good examples, but in 2011, the Chicago Teachers Union had a reform caucus, and so like a more militant caucus, I guess something similar to the bargaining committee that took over at Columbia in 2020, that won the election in order to take over the union. They ran on a reform slate. Ran on the idea that they were going to strike to fight back against the conservative changes that were put in place by Rahm Emanuel, the Chicago mayor at the time. And this strike was this massive citywide effort that involved all of the teachers and the parents. It was a very successful strike that not only won better working conditions, but put pressure on the mayor to not shut down multiple schools in the area. And then in 2018 in West Virginia, the first of the Red for Ed teacher strikes, there were members of DSA who were kind of inspired by Bernie Sanders and the left, who took their organizing skills that they had learned electorally, used social media and used face-to-face organizing to organize their teachers who were in I think like a union that had like 10% membership or something like this. And they were able to organize these workers to go on strike, something that the union hadn't done in decades. This strike in West Virginia, again, the really great thing about education is that you can fight for other people. The teachers not only won 5% increases in education spending, 5% raises for all teachers, but all public employees in West Virginia. So for the janitors, for the accountants, everyone that was a public employee in West Virginia. And so this is why I think education is so powerful. And I guess graduate worker strikes are something kind of similar to this, and they're striking for their students as well as striking for themselves. And so respect to all of you, and thank you for your action this week. And I hope that you continue to fight for everything you deserve. And so to wrap it up, I'll pass to Matt to talk about why he chose to go work in logistics and the importance of logistics as a strategic sector.
Totally. So I chose logistics, I think, mainly because I was attracted to the particular economic leverage that we have as logistics workers. I mean, when you think about it, if you're reading the news at all right now, every business section is talking about the supply chain crisis. And when you're talking about supply chains, you're talking about the logistics industry. And the reason why, when I think of the logistics industry, that's UPS, FedEx, now more so Amazon, Postal Service. You're not just talking about the shipping of goods from like retailers to customers, like you at your house ordering toothpaste on Amazon or something like that. But it's also increasingly so become part of the production process itself, because there's parts, there's parts for a car. There could be parts that are coming from Mexico and then they're assembled in China and then sold like on a lot in Ohio or something like that. And increasingly so, these kind of like parts suppliers and stuff like that rely on something called, a just-in-time inventory sort of thing, where they're ordering. And so they don't want to have too much of a back stock. They want to be ordering their parts basically as if it's part of like an assembly line. So it's like a truck driving a part from one point to another is like part of the production process itself. It's just not taking place like within one factory or something like that. But so if you're going to go on strike, as UPS or as one of these major logistics companies, you're not just, halting for work for your own company, but the ripple effect economically for manufacturing and all types of things like that, it's huge. And that's why, a UPS strike, for example, it wouldn't last nearly as long as something like a Verizon strike, because if you work for Verizon, you're like repairing telephone lines, but once those lines are up, they're working until they're not working anymore. But if you go on strike in logistics, those goods are not moving. Your city is shutting down. These businesses are not getting the goods that they need to sell. So it's not only that you have that economic leverage, but at a certain point, that economic leverage becomes seriously political, because your city is turning into just like it's going dead basically. And so it's not only economic against your kind of company, which is obviously super profitable. Like UPS is a Fortune 50 company, so you can win more for yourself and your union brothers and sisters. But you have the potential to also have serious political and social influence because of that economic leverage that you have. And so I wanted to go into logistics for that reason, because I think that that is pretty fucking awesome. And also, yeah, I mean, I also just like to drive and be outside and stuff like that. So it's not too bad.
Awesome.
Anything
Yeah,
else I should add?
No, that was perfect. Yeah, and I think this is kind of perfect timing as we're wrapping up with a few minutes left. But yeah, I would be really interested. I guess we've had this conversation, I guess, quite a few times with other socialists, but I'm interested to hear, like, just if there are any questions or comments from the members of UAW that are on this call. And if not, thank you all again for the opportunity to present today. And thank you all for your action, and we'll continue to support you however we can from afar.